Welcome to Debating Metal. I'm your host, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, along with my co host, Chris Kaye. Today, we get back to our series, The ABCs of Metal. And today, we're talking about bands that begin with the letter D.
As we've done with the A through C episodes, we'll be pitting bands with the names starting with the letter D against each other in a bracket format to determine who we feel best represents that letter.
And since this will be a two-part episode, we will not have a big four this week. So instead, we're going straight to the brackets. So sit back, relax, turn it up to 11, and let the debate begin.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. Now I know my ABCs. Next time, won't you sing with me?
All right, Chris. So today we're doing the letter D. Bands that begin with the letter D. We've got the tournament all set. I'm pretty sure we've received some feedback on a couple of the letters we've done so far, and one of the guys that we recently been in correspondence with was talking about we missed a band in the letter C, and that's going to happen. We're not going to satisfy everybody with all the different bands that we have and bands that we could possibly put in there. I mean, there's going to be some obscure bands that, you know what, we're just going to leave them off. But this is a big one. We've got 16 bands that we're going to talk about, and we're going to put them head to head against each other, in particular head to heads, and then we're going to go on to the round of eights for us, the quarterfinals, semifinals, and the finals. So why don't you go ahead and start it off?
All right. So for the first bracket, we've got Darkthrone, which is a Norwegian black metal band formed in 1986, 20 studio albums. But that being said, not much of a footprint in the U.S., but major player in the black metal scene. And then they're going up against Demon Hunter, who is a metalcore / Christian metal band formed in 2000. They've got 12 studio albums. Again, not a huge footprint just due to the genres that these two bands are, but kind of diametrically opposed.
Yeah, I think that's the reason why I put them up against each other. It's just one of those things where I felt like this was one of those things where we could have a really interesting discussion about these two bands because they are so diametrically opposed. And even if they the background behind this the music that they're or the words that they're singing, even if it wasn't that diametrically opposed there, just musically they are opposed because one's, like you said, is kind of like a metalcore band. They're clean vocals for the most part, and then you've got another band which is a black metal band. Vocals are coarse, growly, and the musical style is just completely different. So this is a really cool discussion between these two bands.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with Darkthrone as I am Demon Hunter, which also kind of surprises me. Last year, I don't know if it was you or somebody mentioned Demon Hunter, and I kind of checked them out, found some songs I liked. Didn't really kind of go past that, but I have some of their songs on like a playlist. Darkthrone really falls outside of the range of what I typically listen to. I have a lot of respect for the commitment to the genre, that it's really just two guys that have been doing this for almost 40 years. A Blaze in the Northern Sky is an iconic album cover for sure, but like just in general is an iconic album in that genre. I mean, they're definitely different. I mean, Dark Throne has as 15 years over Demon Hunter, so that always kind of can skew like some of the stats and stuff like that. But as far as like um, outreach and ability to connect with a larger audience, I think Dark Throne has a little bit of an edge there.
Okay, I mean, I could buy into that. I mean, so look, Dark Throne, Norwegian black metal band, started all those years ago. It's I've mentioned it on the podcast before, where they were one of the bands that I was really piqued my interest when they came out, when they released Transylvanian Hunger, and I just wanted to see or listen to what this band sounded like. Having never heard this, couldn't really identify what the band said, the name is on the cover, because it's so um it's hard I mean, that's just the way black metal bands in that part of the world just design their logos. And I say that
Mhm.
part of the world because then it's obviously it's branched out from there. But originally it came that way. And so it's like, I was like, oh, I want to listen to this, and I opened it up and I'm like, yeah, I don't want to listen to this anymore. And I kind of sealed it up real quick. It just wasn't my thing. But since that time, which we're talking about 1994, 95, to now, one, my musical taste in metal has changed and altered a bit, thanks to you mostly. And so there's certain things about them that more willing to accept nowadays. However, um, they are still, nothing's changed with that first album, or not. That wasn't even their first album. That was like their second or third album. Nothing's changed about that style. However, they have particularly kind of changed what the way that they sound, I guess, for lack of a better term, over the years. They went from being this, when they first started, when they first put their instruments on, they wanted to be a death metal band, but they quickly changed to that Norwegian black metal style that was just, very terrible sounding recordings and really really harsh vocals. But over the years, even that has changed to be a little bit more professional recordings and stuff like that. But they slowly incorporated doom metal into their sound, and really nowadays are more consistent with the doom metal sound than they are with the black metal. And the one thing I noticed when I was listening to them is, for me, what I heard was a very heavy Celtic Frost influence. So I don't know if you've picked up on that at all or not.
In more modern years, or are you saying in the beginning?
Even a couple of songs towards the beginning, I felt that. There was
Mhm.
one song, I don't know what album it's on. It's called Quintessence. That was a very doom metal song,
Yeah, I
but
definitely
but
hear
there,
the doom influence. Yeah,
right, but there was something about his vocals and the vocal style that he had that kind of sounds very similar to Tom G. Warrior.
gotcha. I can definitely see that. I mean, I see like layers of influence. I mean, early black metal, those guys, and it's funny because like people I've read, there's like the first wave of black metal and second wave of black metal. I think it's silly because I think black metal really started with the guys that were influenced by like Venom and that ilk right around that time. The first group that really coined the term black metal, right? They're part of that. Dark Throne is so. Um, you know, they were kind of creating a lot of the concepts that would be black metal, and that poor recording quality was intentional. The lyrical themes, that everybody was kind of doing the same style, and then eventually they really started to develop their own personalities and bring in some of that stuff they were rejecting at the beginning, like the death metal. I mean, that was specifically cited as like the solos were ridiculous and this and that, and so they were trying to make it more basic and tuned into this anti society kind of mentality. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like, because I think a lot of people, when they hear black metal, they just think of like the early days and the tropes and the forests and the shitty quality and stuff like that. And but a lot of them over time did, like you said, bring in much better recording quality and different themes, and you know, a little bit more experimentation rather than all just kind of doing the same thing. Dark Throne, I like, listening to the guys from Dark Throne talk and stuff like that, where it's interesting to hear, and I've seen them in several documentaries and that kind of stuff. And it is an interesting experience. I personally don't find the music to be um beyond like listening to one or two songs here and there, to be like overall really exciting to my ears. But that being said, I like try to keep in the context of like what's the actual influence and the growth, and how many people have they brought into the metal scene essentially. And um, I think it's interesting. We're focusing mostly on Dark Throne in this discussion at this point, but I think it's also really hard as a Christian metal band to bring in a large influence, which Demon Hunter has done, which is pretty impressive, because I think there is inherently just this anti-Christian sentiment when it comes to music. Um, just stepping outside of society in general, but like to bring in as large of an audience as they have, as many streams as they get and that kind of stuff, I think it's pretty impressive as well.
Oh, I agree. I mean, there's always been that movement, that underlying kind of movement when it comes to metal, and the Christians that want to play it, because obviously these kids who grow up, and they grow up in this society where they go to church, they believe in Jesus and all that stuff. But there's also that part of them that they want to learn and understand rock music, pop music, whatever kind of style of music. And some lean one way, some lean another. And you have bands like Demon Hunter that make a career out of it, and they're doing a great job. They do have very good music, and it's not nothing to take away from them whatsoever. They're very similar in style to, in some cases, there's some songs they remind me a lot of the band Red, which is also another Christian metal band that I got turned on to in the early 2010s. Uh,
Hmm.
and then you have bands like Skillet, which is also Christian metal. And they all owe their existence, for the most part, not really, but to Striper all the way back in the 80s, who basically bucked the trend. You've had all these speed metal bands and LA glam bands that were trying they're just singing about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And then you've got a band like Striper who's basically playing the same music, but you know, their message is, come to Jesus kind of thing, and let Jesus guide you. So they're still here today, Striper, still playing the same style of music, and still preaching the same message. They don't necessarily dress in the same black and yellow, although there is hints of it. It's not as yellow as it used to be. It's more black with the yellow, as opposed to yellow with the
Yeah,
black.
it's more just like normal clothes rather than the planned outfits and
Right.
that kind of stuff.
You know, Demon Hunter. So the funny thing about them with me is I completely confused them for a different band. Um,
Okay.
and so I mean, I'll say the band I thought for some reason that 3 Inches of Blood was Demon Hunter, and vice versa. I don't know what happened. I don't know where along the way I mistook that, but I kept hearing about the popularity of Demon Hunter, and I'm like, oh, good on them, because I knew 3 Inches of Blood was a really heavy band. Demon Hunter is not as heavy as 3 Inches of Blood. And so I'm like, man, this is not the same band I thought it was, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, you know what? It's still this is the band I was looking for or towards, for putting in this particular spot. So I don't know where along the way there was a disconnect, but we're we're
No
here
idea,
now.
man.
So uh, there's that. I will say this though, Demon Hunter. Um, I don't think it's a lack of creativity per se. I think it's obviously in this many albums in a concerted effort to have their logo or their imprint or um that animal, I guess, it's like I don't know if it's a goat head or whatever, with the horns. It is on every single album cover.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty cool because it doesn't really, the size is typically the same, but they incorporate different things about it. Sometimes it looks 3D, sometimes it could just look like a cutout, but that shape is always there, and I think that's pretty cool. I mean, it's very similar to how bands have mascots, right? Iron Maiden with Eddie, uh, and Megadeth with Vic Rattlehead and stuff like that. And this is not necessarily an existing being, but it's just a logo cutout, a logo imprint on their album covers. Pretty neat, if you ask me.
Yeah, I believe it's some kind of demon, and there's always like a hole in the head, so I don't know if it's like, you know, they've killed the demon or something like that. I'd like to look into the lore of it because I don't really know, but I agree. Like I think it's really cool that there's that consistent theme because they actually have some really cool, interesting album covers um, within that uh, image. I mean, I don't feel like it's boring to look at the same because they're like so different, even though that one image is the consistent thing or the shape. Yeah, like you said, the
Okay.
the what's the word? The silhouette.
Right.
Um, so kind of who do you think fits this better? I mean, I think like if you're looking at the you know they both have been through some interesting things, right? Like forming black metal was anti-establishment, kind of like doing something different that wasn't um the norm of what was going on. There was hundreds of death metal bands and that kind of stuff, and these 4 or 5 bands kind of stepped outside of that and created their own scene. It was pretty dark. I mean, we've discussed it many times and what was going on at the time, but I think in some regard, I mean, and it's different because I've spoken to a lot of people who had good experiences growing up with religion, and a lot of people that had bad experiences with it, obviously. And I think a lot of kids that got into metal that I knew growing up, um, they were judged for liking metal because it was demonic and this and that. But there were others that I knew that like found, solidarity in that. I mean, especially as I got older, when I was in high school, college, I was meeting a lot of like Christian kids that were finding metal through their church, actually, which I thought was really crazy because it was like just outside of my age range where that was kind of like okay, like to have Christian metal and things like that. So in some ways it's anti-establishment because like having religion in music sometimes can be off-putting, and it's like a struggle. I mean, listen to Stryper talk about how hard they had it sometimes just because they were Christian. um but there's parallels there, like kind of going against what is the mainstream and doing something different, um kind of being low key genres of music that are not like hitting the masses and that kind of stuff. So they have a lot of similarities in that regard. I think Dark Throne's just been around much longer, has that longevity, has the footprint and the visibility that Demon Hunter doesn't have. Though I enjoy listening to Demon Hunter more.
Right. No, I totally understand that. And the way I'm looking at this between these two bands, um, as much as Dark Throne has changed over the years. I mean, think about their last 7 albums that they put out. They've all reached the charts
Mhm.
uh, in Europe,
They just
specifically
put a new one
Finland.
out too.
Yeah, specifically Finland, Germany, and the UK. I mean, that's come a long way because those first bunch of albums that they put out were just very, very anti-establishment to the point where, like, you had to be a diehard to be buying this kind of thing. Demon Hunter, again, we mentioned at the beginning, diametrically opposed, and they both have like you mentioned, the same struggles to try and reach the masses if that's what they're trying to achieve. Because of the different styles of music and because they're not necessarily in the middle where everyone typically resides, they're to the extreme of one side or the other. It's always going to be a struggle. But in this particular case, I think um, I think Demon Hunters is really going to be more representative of what we're trying to talk about here, which is heavy metal. Um, in terms of, yeah, they're metalcore, but to me, they're closer to the middle than let's say uh, Dark Throne. I mean, you got contemporaries of Demon Hunter like Under Oath, As I Lay Dying, August Burns Red, Norma Jean, Devil Wears Prada. All these bands, there's an underlying Christian theme for these bands, and so they've been lumped into that category, but at the same time, they've been able to branch out and people look at them as just regular metalcore. They don't necessarily categorize them that way.
Okay, so you're going with Demon Hunter?
Yes, I'm going with Demon Hunter.
Okay. I will, I guess, acquiesce on that one because I do see a lot of similarities there, but I prefer Demon Hunter's music. That being said, like I do think that Dark Throne has a strong influence, at least in the our scene as far as like metalheads and that kind of stuff. I doubt that a lot of people know either of these bands. As far as like if you just walked up to somebody on the street and asked them if they knew who either of them was. Um, Dark Throne has appeared in more kind of documentary kind of stuff, but that doesn't really account for like music and in general. It's their footprint and advertising, blah blah blah. But yeah, I mean, I'm fine with the Demon Hunter progressing in the bracket.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Dark Throne, I mean, we know about Dark Throne because this is, for lack of a better term, this is our job, right? So
Yeah.
this is what we do. We talk about metal, and we've expanded our knowledge about metal by talking about it every week. So yes, that's how we know about Dark Throne. That's how we know about black metal and all the stuff like that. That's how we found out about a movie like, Until the Light Takes Us, which really, if anyone out there wants to know a little bit more about Dark Throne, they're featured very early in that documentary, and they talk to the main guy. So that's pretty interesting, even though the movie is mostly about what happened with Mayhem and all that stuff. But then you have we know about those things. So with the Christian Metal Society, the same thing. We don't know too much about it, but we hear about it, so we kind of like, pick up on a thing here or there. I just think in this particular case, Demon Hunter is more of the way to go. I guess put it that way.
Okay, I'll go with that.
Okay, so let's go into our next two bands that we're going to talk about here.
All right, so the next So the next two bands are Dark Tranquility versus Dimmu Borgir. Dark Tranquility was formed in 1989, has 13 studio albums. They're a Swedish band, Swedish death metal band. They're a pretty big influence on the Gothenburg scene that we've talked about a few times before. And then Dimmu Borgir is a Norwegian symphonic black metal band, and they were formed in 1993. They have 10 studio albums, and they're kind of, some people view them as the sellouts of the black metal scene, while others I kind of understand that there was kind of a splitting point in the black metal scene where originally everybody was sticking to the low quality you know, the original tenets of what black metal was, and over time people started to incorporate better sound quality and things like that they adopted pretty early on, and really kind of like stepped outside of that and added orchestral elements and that kind of stuff. So, I get it where like if you're a diehard fan of the concept of black metal and not really the music as much, you're going to be like stuck in that mindset of no, this is it what it is. There's no debating it, whatever. But that's what we do here. We we debate whether that those things are true or not, and so I would say, them adopting and changing their style and trying to find their own sound, I don't think is outside of the realm of like black metal per se. There's the themes as far as like the way the music's written and that kind of stuff that really still feels dark and um uh, like what's the word I'm looking for here? Not edgy per se, but like there is there is still that kind of songwriting thematic feel to the music while they've introduced things like symphonies and more quality of recording.
Oh, I agree. And while you were talking right now, I'm thinking about the fact that what happens anytime that a particular band becomes more popular than the rest of that wave of however many bands are out there. They're always considered a sellout.
Mhm.
Okay, you know, Metallica started as the antithesis or the anti glam scene. They didn't want to be like that, and they were more welcome in the San Francisco area than they were in the LA area. So after they recruited Cliff or tried to bring Cliff on board, Cliff's like, yeah, I'm not going to join unless unless you move to San Francisco. So and then immediately they recorded their first album, and before they anything. I mean, people get a whiff of Fade to Black, they're sellouts. Okay, and so they've been a sellout since their second album, and since 1984. You have a band like Dimmu Borgir, who you have a guy who wants to make this, for lack of a better term, that's it's a popular phrase, more, he wants to make it popular. He wants to bring more people in to listen to that style of music. He made it symphonic, and so it's still a very difficult vocal to listen to. The music is still rough, right? It sounds better than the early black metal stuff, but there's something appealing to it. I mean, you're talking about, look, they don't have any gold or platinum albums, but they have 5 albums in the United States that have sold over 7,000 copies. While that doesn't sound like a lot, when you're talking about this specific style of music, it's a lot, specifically in the United States, that's not known to gravitate towards that kind of music, right? To the point where Death Cult Armageddon is their biggest selling album in the United States, over 130,000 copies sold. And that's huge for that kind of music. I mean, that's huge, in the US. Um, and what's even funnier about that is that there's not a single song from Death Cult Armageddon that actually is in their like top 10 most popular songs on Spotify. So, but so you take the contrast of that from Dark Throne, which we were just talking about, that they changed to a more doomy metal sound and they became more appealing. So did Dark Throne sell out? I would gather in the same sense of the phrase, yes. But Demu sold out into, they're still keeping it black metal, but they just added the symphonic part to it.
And well, it's more than that. It's not just the music. I mean, it's from the way that he's come across in. I'm talking about Shagrath in interviews and things like that that have called or caused him to be called out as a sellout. The music videos, the high quality stuff like that. I mean, it's all different people's perspectives, right? It's not set in stone that this is what it is, and it's just going against. It's so funny to me because it's always something that's anti-establishment becomes the establishment in some way, right? When everybody looks like, you know, the joke was when I was in high school that everybody that was trying to be unique and different, I'm unique and different. I dyed my hair blue. It's like, well, all of you have your hair dyed blue, so now you're just part of a different cult than what you know, said you were fighting against, right? But that's always society. Like, it's not just one thing. It's always, the general consensus, right? Like, everybody becomes part of this anti-establishment movement of punk. Well, all the punkers look the same, you know uh mohawks or whatever. It's just, that's just how people are, right? So I don't hold that against them in any way. I actually owned De- I bought Death Cult Armageddon twice, actually.
So you're part of the
One
130,000 copies.
twice. So I had it on iTunes, which was, I only had one Apple device ever, and I had it on there, and I lost access to my iTunes account, so I rebought it, on CD somewhere down the line. So I listened to them quite a bit. I was a fan for a long time. I don't listen to them quite as much anymore, but I didn't really get into the early stuff because that was more traditional black metal. But what I liked was that symphonic element that was brought into the black metal that made it kind of more theatrical and enjoyable to listen to, at least for me. Dark Tranquility, though, I've been on board since the very, very beginning. I got into the Gothenburg scene of metal early on. I really loved In Flames and At the Gates, and Soil Work at the beginning and stuff like that. Like, we've talked about this on other episodes. In Flames has probably my favorite album of all time. But Dark Tranquility I really enjoyed, and there was a period of time where I was alternating like 2 or 3 albums from them just over and over and over again. And that was like from the era that like Haven came out, and I really got into them. I like Dark Tranquility still to this day. I love how they've kind of like kind of expanded their sound as well with clean vocals, and um even then, like, Michael, who is the lead singer, is doing that project with all the old In Flames guys, which he was the original singer from In Flames as well. And funny enough, the current singer from In Flames was the original singer for Dark Tranquility too. They just like swapped places. But like, they were just very experimental, tried things a little differently than the other guys that were in that scene, but never quite got the level of attention that an In Flames or Soil Work got.
Yeah, there's something to be said about Dark Tranquility. I really, really dig them. I'm still, it's one of those things where I'm still, absorbing all the different styles of melodic death metal. Because, you know, Dark Tranquility has their style. In Flames has their style, which has obviously has changed since uh, Reroots Remain. Um, you're talking about like when we mentioned who is that one, Haunted. Um, you know, all these bands from that area, um, they all get lumped into that Gothenburg sound, or the ones that obviously have it, but um, there's something different about each one. Sort of like how grunge, there was different things about grunge, certain grunge bands that made them all different from each other, but all fell into the same category. Um, so I'm listening to Dark Tranquility, and I'm like, I really dig this. Specifically, ones after there's like the second album when they I guess became more stable and kind of found their groove. They started incorporating, like you said, the clean vocals and the death vocals together. I mean, that's something that I think is pretty cool. like some of that stuff when it's done properly. And you got Michael Stanley who he's doing the vocals. Man, the man's in like what 900 freaking bands. They're all they're all similar in style, which is crazy because like why bother almost, but there's each one of them is different, like he unlike Ripper Owens, these are actually consistent projects where Ripper just joins from album to album, from band to band. Um, but like the halo effect, like you were talking about with the former members of In Flames, there's also
Mhm.
Cemetery Skyline, which is relatively just clean vocals for the most part.
Yeah, it is.
But the music is still that melodic death metal, Gothenburg kind of sound. But the vocals are clean, and that's a super group from bands in that area. I mean, you're talking about has members from Insomnium, Amorphis, Demo, Borgir, and Sentenced, and it's crazy, but yet it's so cool, to hear the fact that they're playing this music and it's clean vocals. Regardless of that, um, Michael being in 10 different bands or whatever it may be, that music, I think Dark Tranquility is probably his number one, I would assume. And
It's his main band. It's his main
yeah,
focus. Yeah.
so they're very consistent, but their music has been great. Um, I like what they've done and what they've put out over the years, and I'm getting more and more into them as the years have gone by. Me listening to more and more melodic death metal. By comparison, I don't listen to Dimmu Borgir as much as you used to. I don't. I mean, it's just not my thing. It just really isn't. Like I try when we were talking about Behemoth a few episodes when we were talking about the letter B. Um, it they're from Poland and they're in that same style. There's black metal, but they've made it this. It's like they're being like the leaders of this black metal scene now because they so popular through their genre, you know, and that's the same thing with Dimmu, and you have bands like Dark Throne and other stuff that still exists, but they're just not at that same level, you know. But while Dark Throne has gone more doomy, you have Behemoth and Dimmu who just continue to stay in that realm, but they've expanded it and they've made it better, if you will. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's no denying that like a band like Dimmu Borgir is going to have more reach than people that stay truer to the black metal sound. But I don't think that immediately just makes them um, better in any way. It just makes them more mainstream. I
Mhm.
think I think sticking to that original format of black metal, it's a double-edged sword because I mean obviously that's what the progenitors of the genre intended it to be, was like a place for us and not them. And it's funny how that becomes this thing, like we kind of brought up the argument for gatekeeping before, and is gatekeeping a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, obviously, you can just inherently say it's a bad thing. Well, but at the same time, I think there is an argument for the mindset of like, well, we went through all the bullshit, and now all these people just get to come in and enjoy it without ever having to experience what we experienced. Well, that's what society should do. Like we should be not looking just at the past as victims, but as like people that can, we suffered so that you can do something great. Well, I get it from both sides, totally understand, but I'm more of the mindset of like, yeah, I'm glad more people are listening to metal. Like, I don't want to hold people back from that, just because when I was younger, people gave me shit about it and stuff like that. So I like these bands that can bring in a wider audience, just by existing. sometimes, like I always call them like gateway metal bands, right? And
Mhm.
funny enough, like not Dark Trink, sorry. Funny enough, Dimmu Borgir has a song called Gateways, which became very popular, and brought more people into the scene. So like, it is interesting to say from that perspective, but I think also Dark Tranquility has had really, big footprint as well in that same vein, and has brought some people in, maybe not as much as like an Amon Amarth or someone like that, but um I think both have their validity in that regard.
I agree. I mean, I agree in terms of, Dark Tranquility has moved their category, their genre of metal. They've moved the needle. So has Dimmu Borgir. They've moved the needle for their category of metal.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. That kind of reflecting on your gatekeeping part of it. To me, I've always looked at it, if someone's gatekeeping, right, and you say, okay, I'm only going to let so many people in, or I only, let the real people in, right? But the bottom line to me is that when you have something that attracts more people, that's not a bad thing at all. You know, maybe that person needs to be attracted, and let those people in. And then that person can sit there and say, hey, man, check this out. This is cool. And that brings another person in. So gatekeeping, while I understand why people do it, it's just dumb, in my opinion, because you're leaving people out that want to be part of this. Again, not everybody is going to want to do that all the time, and that's why you're trying to gatekeep. I get that, but allow those people in, because you know what, they could be good for you too.
I
you
know.
know
I think there is some. And I guess we shouldn't dwell on this too long, but there is some aspect of when you're part of a scene or something initially, it's usually a small group. And then as time goes on, then you have things like, it grows and grows and grows. And then, you can't be involved in the same way you once were because there's so many people involved. And so like we went to see Metallica, a couple years ago at this point, and it was in a mega stadium essentially, and I had never seen an audience that big at a show, and it's cool, but it's not intimate, right? And
right.
so I can understand why, if you're a fan of a concept like black metal, you would not want the scene to grow beyond, the outcasts that created it. And so I don't agree with it, but I'm just saying I understand that perspective. So I see why black metal fans are not fans of Dimmu Borgir because of that. Like, you're trying to bring too many people into something that is built around the concept of anti-establishment and feeling hurt in society, right? And so um yeah, it's a touchy subject in that way, and not in something. And I don't. When I say touchy subject, I don't feel like most things are off the table to discuss, and I hate, bringing things down to the level of like, oh, the words hurt my feelings. But what I mean is, like, I get where they're coming from.
Right. No, I totally understand that. All right, so swinging it back around to who we're going to move on this tournament. um I'm going to sit here and say Dark Tranquility should move on, in my opinion. Um, Not because of anything, because they both have done a lot for their respective genres of heavy metal. But I think Dark Tranquility, it's just, to me, there's something about them that is better.
From the perspective of like sales stats and that kind of stuff, I think Dimmu Borgir wins out. They have a higher profile as far as like listeners on Spotify, like double what Dark Tranquility does on Spotify. Um, and I mean, I love Dark Tranquility. Don't get me wrong. I think they're a better band in a lot of ways, and I enjoy what they do. But as far as like, you know putting someone on this list that like represents even though people don't like them as black metal band, some people don't. I'm not saying all, but at the same time, like I think they represent a larger chunk of the listeners as a whole. Um, Even though it is kind of an oddity, I don't think a lot of times when we're discussing things that black metal is going to end up high on a list is just because of our biases. But I think Dimmu Borgir actually wins this time.
You say so. Okay. Let me see here. Um, you're going for Demu. I like Dark Tranquility, but you know what? I'm gonna take the personal feelings out, and I'm gonna go with you on this because I feel, by just the sheer essence of what Demo has done for their genre, I think when as reevaluating that in these last few minutes, I can agree with that. Because they have done something s- that brings in more people. Where Dark Tranquility, they're consistent, and they're in their realm. Um, there's, I think, more to Demu than meets the eye, I guess you could say.
I would say, like, if this was strictly on who I prefer, because I would put Dark Tranquility up there in my top bands. I would list them, but just from the perspective of like what you just said, where it's um, the impact that they've had, whether good or bad, whatever your perspective is on the black metal scene, I think they just have a much wider commercial reach in this regard. And I don't think that amounts to commercial reach as we've discussed before. Like, yeah, I think it matters, but it's not the be all end all either. I just think they're a high quality performer of their genre, and I can't take that away from either band. But at the same time, this one statistic kind of like pushes them in a higher direction for me.
Okay, I can go with that. I can go with that. So we're going to put Demo Borgir moving on, and they'll be facing Demon Hunter in the next round. Okay, so that brings us now to our next two bands to discuss, and that's Deicide versus Death. This is a quite interesting head-to-head here. This matchup, Deicide versus Death. What do you got?
All right, so Deicide was formed in 1987. They have 13 studio albums, about 200 monthly listeners, or sorry, 200,000 monthly listeners on Spotify.
200. That's
200.
it. Really? I,
Yeah.
I, can, I can get 200.
Right. Death is was formed in 1983. They were one of the Florida progressive death metal bands. Progressive. Wow. Let me start that over. They were original death metal band and geared towards progressive as the years went on. They have 7 studio albums. Unfortunately, Chuck Schuldiner, the really the band, the creator of the band has passed away in 2001, and obviously there can never be anything beyond that. But multiple, tribute bands have formed from former members, around that that particular, like, that's a weird way to say it. Let me just say multiple tribute bands have been formed around the concept of death from original members of the band. And so, like, they do have a pretty wide influence, and over 3 million worldwide uh, sorry, over 3 million worldwide monthly listeners on Spotify. So pretty vast valley between 3 million and 200,000.
You're right. That is a big disparity. Well, let's touch on Deicide real quick. Look, they have no gold or platinum albums, right? Neither does Death. Okay, so then we go to, let's see what else they have. Their first 6 albums for Deicide basically came prior to the streaming revolution. They each sold more than 16,000 copies. Is that a lot? No. but think about the style of music that they're playing. It's just not. It's not mainstream at all. But when you look at the first 3 albums when they began, each album sold over 86,000 copies, including their sophomore album, which Legion, which sold over 100,000 copies. That's in that style of music in the day and age when people were buying physical copies. For that style of music, that's a lot of copies sold. That's a lot of just people listening to what you're doing. I mean, when you think about a gold record is 500,000 copies, and that's a pretty big popular album. 100,000 copies of a basically a death metal album that gears itself towards Satan is really a huge thing. Now, if let's flip it down to death. Like you said, 7 studio albums. They basically were one of the first bands, that was doing this style of music, death growl vocals, the death metal, the subject matter. Deicide came in a little bit after that, and took it in a completely different direction. When you look at all the releases that Death have put out, obviously 7 studio albums, like you said, 3 official live albums, 2 of which were more in support, more out there to support Chuck's cancer treatment, and then 1 was posthumous to commemorate the 4th anniversary of his death. So that's, you're looking at these things out there that are, 2 albums trying to help Chuck, and then later on, after he passed away, you've got Relapse Records, who put out a series called the Onstage series, which was a bunch of live albums, if you want to put it that way, live recordings. Some of them were really bootleg sounding. I think that's the whole idea behind it, but it got the name continued to be out there, and then I just, there's something about Death that I like, but at the same time, there's something about Death I don't like. So we have this, I almost, they're not diametrically opposed bands, but they are not necessarily in the same lane, put it that way. They might be on the same highway.
I mean, they started in the same way because not in the same way. They started in the same lane, I would say, because they were both Florida death metal bands. Now, the content of the music obviously is different because one is more like satanic in general. But what I was going to say with Death was that originally started out as, kind of theatrical in a way, as far as the content was more around gore and that kind of stuff, and then that quickly changed into social issues and then progressive sounds, as far as Chuck was always trying to change the sound of Death with each album. He brought on different members that attributed different things, and he was very receptive to what their contributions would be, especially early on. Even guys that he develop problems with, which I think there's a lot of stories now that kind of conflict with the story of him being an overlord and this and that, where they talk more about how he was receptive to a lot of the contributions. James Murphy, being one of them, talked about it, and he said during the recording process that Chuck was super kind, super interested in what anybody brought to the table, and allowed them to do what they wanted, which there was a lot of stories early on that said, like, he was he was a dictator and this and that, and that's why nobody stayed with him, which I think that was just hurt feelings at the time, but none of us were there, so we don't know. So the thing is, like, what I enjoy about Death is also, like, the fact that they didn't stay consistent. He was always, driving forward and doing something different. If you listen to Scream Bloody Gore and you compare it to Sound of Perseverance, which is the first and last albums, they sound drastically different. And that's because there was a tremendous amount of growth over time. The thing with Deicide is that it's been more geared to being consistent. And I would say, yeah, there's been changes over time, especially because there's been lots of turnover with different members and stuff like that. But the general theme is not really changed. It's kind of like talking about, Exodus, or, some of these other bands as compared to, other members of the scene, where it's like, yeah, you kind of know what you're getting, which is either a good or a bad thing. Like, some people want their band that they love to never change. Um, I'm not one of those people. I enjoy feeling that change over time.
To me, if a band stays the same throughout their entire career, it gets kind of stagnant. And I mean, even if you think about Slayer, I mean, between their first, second, and third albums, they changed. Okay, and obviously the first album, they were brand new. They no budget. Second album, they got into their groove. They had a little bit bigger budget, but still not a bigger budget. And then they finally signed to relatively, it wasn't a major label, but they had more money, and they came out with their seminal album, Rain and Blood. um does that make them, having changed that much? Look at the next album. They slowed it down dramatically in comparison, and it kind of really sets the tone for seasons in the abyss that comes after that. And from that point forward, they pretty much stayed pretty consistent, even though there were a couple of things in the 2000s where they experimented, but it didn't necessarily change per se their speed or their anger, I guess, in the way stuff comes across. And Deicide, it's like, yeah, they same subject matter, hasn't changed at all. Satan, period, except for maybe one song where he wrote about his divorce from his wife, and he fucking hates her. but, but granted, Glenn Benton, who is the basically the driving force behind Deicide, has a particular style, has a particular subject matter he wants to go on. I will commend them. They have slightly changed a little bit in terms of maybe a little bit more groove into their stuff, maybe slowing down the drums a little bit, or not necessarily slowing down, but changing the patterns. Because the first stuff, it was just too much to listen to. I'm not a big fan of that kind of style of death metal. When you listen to all the blast beats, think about this, and for the more technical listeners out there, okay, all those blast beats and all that double bass stuff is moving and pushing a serious amount of air through those speakers, and it has a certain kind of effect on the ear, very similar to when you have a car that's driving in, at high speeds, and you decide to open the window on the highway, and all of a sudden there's just like this fluttering sound of things that are bothering your ear, because your ear is a drum too, so it's reverberating. You don't want to hear that. And that's what happened to me with a lot of this early Deicide stuff, where later on they kind of became a little bit less like that. I mean, there's still touches and hints of it, and that's fine. But to be every song like that is a lot. So I commend them for that. Death really do like the latter stuff much more than the early stuff that they put out. You could see Chuck maturing as a songwriter over each progressive album as they went on. So I think the biggest similarity between them, I think that they obviously both bands recorded albums at Morris Sound Studios in Tampa, and it's just that death metal sound, that Florida death metal sound, was just the sound of itself, just the way it was recorded, and sort of like the Gothenburg sound, where that one is more appealing to me. The death metal sound of Florida, just, I didn't like it. Other bands like Obituary and Cannibal Corpse all have that same sound. It
Mhm.
just it doesn't jive with me. Well, that's why I like Death's later albums, because they kind of got away from that sound, where the drums are a lot more clear. The guitar is a lot more uh, recorded better, crunchier, better sounding. It's hard to put it this way. It's cleaner sounding. It's much more, you're able to really hear all the tone of it, where the muddy early Florida death metal sound just doesn't do it for me. So
Yeah.
I think I know which way you're leaning.
Well, just to kind of elaborate, like I've talked a bit about this in the past, but like the drummers that I like are the ones that surprise me. And what I mean is like you may have the same guitar riff going on, but then with the drum beat, what you would expect it to be is just repeating the same pattern over and over, but there's something else going on behind it. And so I always enjoyed everything that was going on with Death in that regard because each drummer brought something very different to the table. Like Sean Reiner was amazing with his work on uh, Human, because like what he and Paul Masvidal came in from Cynic, and they were more heavily jazz influenced and brought in a little bit different perspective than some of the guys that had been there before. And then you have Gene Hoglan who came in, and he is a very unique drummer in the way he was doing triplets and that kind of stuff. And then Richard Christie later, I mean, again, just phenomenal drummers that brought something really interesting to what they were doing with each album. You had different guitarists on many of the albums, and even bringing in like Andy LaRocque to just do solos and that kind of stuff. Like there was always some kind of experimentation that really drove things forward. And you can't just like listen to one album and know who that band is, which I wouldn't say is fair to assess Deicide the same way. It's like you said, there is more groove that was brought in over time. I think the songwriting in general is better as time goes on. Maybe not. I think there's kind of like the what do you call it, the arc where it gets better and then kind of becomes a little bit more repetitive. So it's like I don't really listen to Deicide. I'll admit. And I'm probably a bit biased when I choose Death, but I definitely do choose Death over Deicide. Not just because of like my personal biases, it's just I think they have had a renaissance as well. There's so many forums and that kind of stuff, and not forums, but like on YouTube videos. Like I follow a lot of different channels, and it's funny how many times in these metal channels people bring up Death who were not even alive when Chuck was around. So they've had a renaissance. They have found a bigger audience even now since the passing of Chuck.
They
And
found a bigger audience since his death, which
yeah.
it's interesting to put it that way.
Yeah, and so I think by far Death wins this one.
I would agree with you on that. To my point earlier, Deicide, more than I think it's about 2/3 of their albums were recorded at Morrisound, and all of Death's albums except for the first one, Scream Bloody Gore, was recorded at Morrisound. It's not necessarily to say that Morrisound is the reason why it sounded that way. It's just that's the way the bands sounded at the time, and as you could tell, both bands, Deicide and Death, have the sound has improved and the quality of the sound improved over the years.
Yeah.
A lot of that has to do with technology. A lot of it has to do with budget. A lot of that has to do with just knowing how to manipulate sound.
Well, and
So,
also it's fitting into a genre. Like I
yeah,
think a lot of times early on, like when a genre is new, the bands are kind of pigeonholed into a certain sound. And as we've really known more about this by doing this podcast, the industry has a lot of influence that they shouldn't have influence on. And they're going to try to pigeonhole bands into a certain sound, or we're not going to release your album unless you have a hit on it, like Cherry Pie, that story. So um you know a, a lot of those early albums, like they're stuck doing that thing, whatever it is, and then once their album sells or enough or whatever, then they have a little bit more influence and they can fight back against the industry. But um Yeah.
No, I totally understand that, and that's pretty much an accurate statement. Understanding how this works nowadays. So, based on that, I also agree with you. I think Death, in terms of influence, in terms of mass appeal, I think I'm going to go ahead and go with Death as well. So, Death moves on, and they're going to face the winner between Danzig and Def Leppard. what what do you have with that?
Well, those are basically two the same band, so
Oh yeah.
Um, so Danzig was formed in 1987. Danzig, who was famous for, or Glenn Danzig, who was famous for his time in the Misfits, and then Sam Hain or Sawane, however you say it. Um, uh, Basically, kind of like a heavy metal slash horror punk band, more metal influenced than his previous bands, and now has about 12 studio albums. Um, Def Leppard was formed in 1977. They also have 12 albums, and we're more in the arena rock, um, I guess hard rock, glam genre, I would say. Um, but has multi-platinum diamond albums in Hysteria and Pyromania. Really massive mainstream success. What's interesting about Def Leppard is that once they left the UK, they became bigger in the US and kind of stayed here for quite a while than, going back to the UK. Kind of an interesting path that they went on. First album was very much more heavy, and then they became a glam arena act as time went on.
So Def Leppard, okay, early on Def Leppard, when I first discovered them, they were I believe they had already released Pyromania by the time I really discovered them, but MTV played their two or three songs, three actually, the three videos that were off of High and Dry. They played them all the time, so I really took to High and Dry as well as Pyromania, and Pyromania having all the hit singles that it had, Rock of Ages, Photograph, and so on. It's like, yeah, this is pretty cool. This was, you know, a really good, you know, transformation from the new wave of British heavy metal into what they became. Um, and I was really excited for what they were going to put out next. Now, mind you, 4 years later it comes Hysteria, so that's a completely different beast all by itself. But so that time period in the early '80s, Def Leppard was a hard rock band, heavy metal band for the early glam, scene and all that stuff. Although they were never in that glam scene, it was just they were obviously from UK and they did their thing. They got on a lot of early tours. Um,
There
because
was
of
just nobody that like really was doing exactly what they're doing, so they get kind
right,
of pushed into that genre. Even though, yeah, you're right, they were never glam.
right. They were never glam, but they were also never. They didn't play the circuit or anything like that in LA.
Yeah, musically they were more glam than other stuff, but that's about it.
Correct. And realistically, when you think about what there was more into the pyromania, more of the hysteria stuff that was kind of touching the glam scene rather than like stuff that was on High and Dry, not even close. Even though it's
Yeah.
really good music. When you compare it to the first album, On Through the Night, and then High and Dry, those are closer in sound. You can see the progression in their songwriting abilities, and then put in, then putting them together with Mutt Lang to produce their albums. I mean, it made a huge difference on High and Dry, and then it progressed into Pyromania, which then progressed into Hysteria. Each successive progression getting more and more uh, less heavy, but more and more production heavy in terms of what they were doing. Plus, the accident to Rick Allen, that changed how everything was going to be done on Hysteria. So, um, I like Def Leppard. I like the early Def Leppard more than the newer Def Leppard. But you cannot deny their success. I mean, 2 diamond albums is amazing, and then 5 platinum albums 8 if you can include their compilations, 2 of which are diamond. I mean, that's just, and then on top of that, 3 gold records. So there's just a lot of success, a lot of accolades. When you converse that with Danzig, not the same, obviously. um, so let's touch on Danzig a little bit. I mean, look, their first album, the self-titled Danzig album, is basically a classic amongst people who know, like, if you want to put it like that. And if and doing the research for this album, I began to or for this episode, I began to realize, man, the first 3 Danzig albums were pretty damn good. They're very consistent. While he didn't have the same success as the first album, they successively, or progressively, each of the first 3 albums all have a similar sound. But you could tell that he's getting more and more mature in the songwriting. But they're still good albums, and the fourth one isn't that bad either. But at the same time, while he, the first, second, third albums, he reinvented heavy blues rock, and he blended it with that really unique vocal style of his. That ever since the fourth album and on, it's just a matter of timing and the way the music business changed. He tried to change his songwriting to adapt to the ever-changing music business, and that just did not bode well for the fans. It did not bode well for the style of music he was putting out, to the point where he eventually had to go back to what he used to do, which I think most people, that's their biggest fault, is changing who they are for somebody else, and so obviously Danzig's career, for lack of a better term, stalled. While he continued to put out album after album after album, the success became less and less and less. Where you have someone like Def Leppard, where album after album after album, the success was just more and more and more, culminated with Hysteria. But even then, the album after that, Adrenalize, while much more like Hysteria and much less than Pyromania, still was a successful album, still had some good songs on it. Every band has that one album that they're never going to touch again. So for Def Leppard, that was Hysteria, but they still have put out so many more albums since then. I mean, think about when you talk about 12 studio albums, and Hysteria was their 4th. Okay, 8 more albums after that. While the ones that are in the latter day nowadays type of era, not as successful, nobody's as successful as that, because the whole industry has changed, and the way that you consume music has changed. So I don't know. This is an interesting one because of Def Leppard and Danzig being technically contemporaries, and seeing how their careers have basically diverged away from each other in such a contrast. It's interesting to see that dichotomy of one trying to change and the other one not really giving a shit and just sticking to their guns on it.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of address something you said, like he stalled out after Danzig 4, which is 100% right. I think in some regard you could say the same for Def Leppard. Was after really Adrenalize, they kind of stalled out as far as, people aren't interested that much in their newer music, and that's from 1992 on. But they are such a big act for the early stuff that they almost became a legacy band very, very early on. People don't go looking for whatever they put out on their Diamond Star Halos album. Like, I wonder how many listeners out there even know what that I'm talking about when I say that.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, but like, people don't go to see Danzig for what he put out on Danzig Sings Elvis,
Although that's pretty cool.
It is, but if he had done it when he was much younger, when I would have enjoyed it more. because it's not great. Um, it's not horrible, but it's not great. Like you said, those first four Danzig albums are really solid, like really good stuff. Actually really like all four of them. First one is probably my favorite, but I mean, Lucifuge was really good. I got into Danzig for a while and the Misfits like in high school, where I was just really enjoying a lot of that stuff at the time, and I think like because of his attitude and how much of like he wants control of what things are, like he paired up perfectly with Rick Rubin, who kind of allows people to, you know, be themselves and kind of pushes them to be themselves in their sound, which I think worked really well. You know, when you do something different with different producers than that don't necessarily mesh with you, or you know, like we've seen a million times where the band decides, oh, I can do this myself, you know, and really they need that somebody to push back on them too, because we're not right all the time. Um, Despite what some people think. But yeah, like I mean, Danzig's more in my alley as far as like what I like to listen to, but I have a lot of respect for what Def Leppard does, and in the you know those first few albums, like I think are really solid. You know, mostly for me, High and Dry, Pyromania, Hysteria. That's kind of that pocket of what I'm interested in with Def Leppard. Um, Not really that big on Through the Night and pretty much anything after Hysteria. Um, but Danzig's kind of the same. Like it's that pocket of just like the beginning, like the first four albums I really liked. I had given other stuff chances, and maybe I will again, because you know, as we've done this show, like what I like is changed. You know, I get excited about different stuff than I used to, and so maybe it's time for me to kind of go through and readdress some of that older stuff. But or not older stuff, but like some of the stuff that came after those albums. But I did kind of like touch on little things here and there, and I did find some cool stuff that like I was like, yeah, I like this. But as far as like overall, you know, impact, and I mean, I think Def Leppard dominates Danzig in this one. Like if you're like a you know punk, um, you know. What's the word I'm looking for? Like anti-establishment, kind of like small scene guy. Like, yeah, of course Danzig kicks ass, but like, man, Def Leppard is just massive. Like they played stadiums for how long? You know, just massive, multi-platinum diamond record band. You know,
Oh yeah, I mean there's something to be said about that. You know, like you mentioned it before when we saw Metallica at NRG Stadium. I mean, 74,000 people, and
Mhm.
I mean, place filled to the rafters, right? And you know, we're in our seats while we still had a decent view. They still were far away, you know,
Yeah,
and there's something to be said. When you and I go to concerts together, you know, the local concerts, or not necessarily local concert, the smaller venue concerts. I mean, it's something about being, you know, front row, right in front of a band on stage, and you can almost touch their feet if you wanted to, because that, you know, that's how close you are.
yeah.
Um, you know
Yeah,
that.
like to me, Armored Saint, where John came out into the crowd and we were standing right in front of the band. We were right in the at the front. I think that's a better show than the massive stadium shows that we've been to.
Right, and you know, there's a different way of dealing with the fans in that regards. You know, Metallica does it with the drones, the big video screens, the different styles of things that you could see, the stage being this enormous thing, you know, and being able to go around literally a quarter mile around that stage and see all their fans that are right there. It's different than being, you know, when you see a metal church or an armored saint or that right in front of your face, and they're, you know, they're just, you can see them so close that you know what they look like for real. You
Hmm.
know, it's a big difference in that. But at the same time, I want to see Metallica but I know that's the way I'm going to see him, right?
Yeah.
And is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. Is it a great thing? Not necessarily. Um, I don't know. Metallica would not have the same impact if they hadn't changed their musical style, and I could see them in a club. It's not the to me, it's not the same band because they
Mhm.
wouldn't have been as successful. They wouldn't have done the same music, you know. But uh, you know, talking about Def Leppard and Danzig, I mean, I've seen Danzig at an arena. I've seen Danzig at a small amphitheater. Um, and I've never seen Def Leppard live. Um, so that's something to be said there too. I agree with you. Def Leppard being as massive as they have been in the past and still relatively are, um, is going to move them on in this tournament just because there's the appeal across. We're talking about heavy metal. Danzig is never really super heavy metal, but it was more to me like really heavy hard rock blues. Has always been his style. Um, so I'm gonna give it to Def Leppard too.
All right.
All right, so Def Leppard moves on, and they're going to be facing Death in the next round. This round now we continue with Dokken versus Disturbed.
All right. Dokken was formed in 1978. They are a U.S. glam / hard rock band. Um, I mean, mostly known for their early era with the classic lineup and band animosity. 10 million plus um, platinum, 10 million plus worldwide sales, including platinum success for Tooth and Nail. And then you have Disturbed, who is a new metal band from the US, formed in 1994. They've got 8+ albums and 17 million sales, so more sales in that regard. Biggest hit would probably be Down with the Sickness. I think just about anybody knows that song. Consistent with #1 albums. Really huge as far as a new metal band. I would say, up there, not quite with the likes of Linkin Park. I think Linkin Park's probably the biggest new metal band of all time. Um, but Disturbed is certainly up there.
You know, what's funny when these bands, were popular in the 2000s. I never looked at them as new metal. I really didn't understand that whole category because unlike grunge, where you kind of knew everybody was from Seattle and everyone played, they all had a kind of similar look, if you want to say it that way. None of them dressed the part. None of them dressed a particular uh, like they didn't. The clothes that they wore were pretty much the clothes that they wore out. Whereas they didn't have stage costumes. Now, uh, when you looked at it, but grunge was different. Alice in Chains was different than Pearl Jam. Pearl Jam was different than Soundgarden. Soundgarden was different than the Melvins, and the Melvins were different than Screaming Trees. New metal, you know, started in 1992 by Korn, or 93 or 94, whatever year it was, early 90s. Korn doesn't do what Disturbed does. Disturbed doesn't do what System of a Down does. System of a Down doesn't do what Linkin Park does or Limp Bizkit. It's so different from each one of those, and they all get lumped into it. So, getting back to the point, the sickness, while there's something about David Draymond's vocals that kind of stand him apart in the sickness, um, to me, I didn't look at it as new metal. I looked at it as something different and cool because of his vocals. And then as the albums progressed, while he did less and less of that start, stop, staccato kind of style of vocal, it, less and less did the band sound like a new metal band to me, my opinion. This is me, Kenneth Dean, Adina Metal saying this. And I know your opinion is way different on that as well. But I think the sickness, I mean, shit, the accolades by themselves stand alone. I mean, Disturbed, 6 gold albums, as you were saying, and 5 of them went double platinum or better. I mean, that's pretty freaking damn good. What I find completely unique about Disturbed is they have 17 gold selling singles, 10 of which went platinum. It almost makes them sound like they're a singles band, which in reality they weren't. To have that many singles certified platinum and gold that was amazing to me. I looked up that information. I'm like, holy shit! Even big bands, don't have that many singles and that many gold and platinum singles.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really surprised by that, which made me look into some more stuff and realize things about like Metallica that I didn't know looking at their certifications, but that's another story for another time. When you go to Dawkins' accolades, their early career was pretty popular, but it was a very short period of time when you look at it. It's not as big of a time period as it may seem, even though they've been around since 78. Realistically, they didn't get signed until 81. Their first album didn't come out in the US for another 2 years until 1983. And they were almost dropped by their record company. It's like, it was Dawkins that had to convince them, give me one more shot. And they pulled it off. And they pulled it off with 3 back-to-back-to-back platinum albums. But after those 3 platinum albums, they literally were on the Monsters of Rock tour with Metallica. They both have the same management, and everybody was going crazy for Metallica. And they were sitting there talking to their manager, and it's like, yeah, we're gonna break up. Because this is just not doing it for us. Why did you put us after Metallica? You should have put us before Metallica. Well, Metallica was nothing in 1988. Nothing. I mean, yeah, they had their popularity with Master of Puppets, but you're talking about mainstream popularity. Metallica still hadn't touched MTV. Master of Puppets wasn't as big as Back for the Attack. So technically, yes, because Dawkins was bigger, they were later in the bill, but they were actually right after Metallica. They got their ass kicked every day, on that summer tour, and they broke up after that because they were just ironically dysfunctional.
Well, I mean, they hated each other. I mean,
Yeah.
George and Dawn didn't want to be in the same room. I mean, I've listened to a lot of stuff regarding that band after that time period, and I would say that Jeff Pilson seems to be the most grounded as far as like what he says about things. I think everybody's been very kind to Mick Brown as far as like their belief of like what he contributed, and I think like everybody kind of says like the songs wouldn't have come together without him because of what he brought to the table, but he was never a major songwriter. But there's kind of the story of Don says he wrote everything, and then Jeff and George say, well, we wrote a lot of the stuff. Don would contribute, very vital information, and then Mick would kind of like bring in his thoughts into things as far as like, oh, well, what if we did this differently? Which I think sounds more reasonable, right? Like that's pretty much typically any band. But you talk about a petty band, like just everybody has issues. Not everybody has issues with everybody, but I think like different camps have different issues with other members of the band. Typically it's like Jeff and George versus Dawn, but Dawn hates just George, and oh my god, what a mess. That band could have been massive had they gotten over their egos, but it's one of those things like some people just can't work together, and that's the clear picture of it. and then running into the timeline change of like what was coming out in the late 80s, early 90s. Yeah, they weren't going to survive. They tried to get back together. They did that dysfunctional album, which was not great by any means. It was, I mean, everything they've put out since then. I think we did a Doc and Worst to First, and I mean, some of the stuff that came later, there is some good material, but man, like that little pocket of those four albums, even though, yeah, the first one wasn't successful at the time, but in retrospect, it's a fun album. I really like it. But like the three that came after it, yeah, they're much better, and they're really good. Um, but that being said, while I'm not the biggest Disturbed fan, I you can't deny who they are. They've been everywhere, and like you said, singles. Just, I mean, they've been used on so many movies and TV shows and wrestling and this and that, and like, I mean, they're a huge band. And I know like you don't view them as new metal or whatever, but like they were like they're part of that scene, even though it was again a conglomeration of things that aren't exactly the same, just kind of like grunge. Grunge, all those bands get lumped together even though they didn't sound exactly the same either, but it's that movement. I think sometimes metal genres are more about the attitude at the time of like something different than what was there before, and they all get kind of lumped together, like Limp Bizkit and Linkin Park, Disturbed, Slipknot. Some of those they're not necessarily anywhere near the same, but somehow they were all in that same scene that were coming out at the same time and feeling different, and it was the right thing to call it at the time. um so and a lot of them had the same influences, and I think that's a factor as well. They're coming out of that like rap rock stuff that like brought in some of those elements that not again, not necessarily the same thing, but their influences are kind of felt. So I think Disturbed wins this one, hand over fist, unfortunately. Like I like I said unfortunately, like unfortunately for Dawkins, I mean to say. Dawkins was a good band. It was, I think, is the right word.
Eh,
um
Don still doesn't want to officially retire, but they're not good anymore, really. I mean, his voice is shot, and he doesn't want to admit it. Jeff Pilson, is like you said, the only reasonable mind over there in that camp. I mean, you could tell that Jeff Pilson was the reasonable guy because guess what? He's had an amazing career outside of Dokken, being
yeah
the musical director of Foreigner, um, and what he brings to the table there. I mean, you're not a musical director. You're not in charge of something unless you're pretty stable and grounded. And that dude is really cool in that regards. You know, so he admits things that have happened in the 80s and stuff like that, and knows that there were certain things that you just can't do those things anymore.
yeah
And he just the fact that he moved on and was able to do the things that he did shows that he was really the smart one, I guess you want to put it that way. Dawkins, was stuck in his thing. George tried to do different things here and there outside of Dawkins, but never really amassed much else, other than Lynch Mob, which they did okay in the mid to late 80s and or late 80s, you put it that way, early 90s. And then Mick, he was always with Don. He was just there doing his thing and getting paid.
hmm
you know so I agree with you. Disturbed, bigger band, lot more impactful overall. So I like them moving on. All right. So, with that said, Disturbed defeats Dawkins in this round. So, that's going to bring us to Death Angel versus Dark Angel. This is the Battle of the Angels. And what do you got here?
All right, Death Angel was a Bay Area thrash band formed in 1982. They have 9 studio albums and have kind of remained in that thrash scene since the beginning. Dark Angel was formed in 1981. Again, a U.S. thrash band. Has 5 albums. And took a really long hiatus. Now is kind of back in 2025, I think, is when they started back. Um, you know, kind of similar paths, but both relatively unknown um, throughout the normie scene. But if you're a metalhead, you've heard of both bands.
So, when you were talking about earlier the you know, the differences between these bands that kind of stick to the same uh style, sound, and vision, for their band, and then you have bands that want to see more, want to bring more to the table. Um, Death Angel is one of those bands, like you mentioned, Exodus. They really didn't stray far from the what they were doing, what they started out with, and while there was some touches of things with Death Angel that was different, they had a little bit of a funkiness to them because of their guitar player and their bass player. That really didn't um, change the fact that they were a thrash band. And they've actually leaned on since their reunion in the late 2000s. They've really, really just kind of leaned into the thrash part of their history, and that's fine, and that's what they do, and they've found that niche, and that's what they're doing, and I actually appreciate that a lot more than bands that try 10 different things and then none of it is successful. They found their niche, they stuck to it, very similar to Exodus, where it's just that's what they're going to do, and this is who we are, and take it or leave it, like it or don't. you know I like some of the stuff that um excuse me, that Death Angel has put out, but I've never really been a big fan of theirs, uh and that's just my take on them. Same thing with Dark Angel, um especially since they basically disappeared after 1991. I had heard a lot about them, and I had heard a lot about Gene being this crazy amazing drummer, and they were this thrash band. But again, you sit in a particular pocket, you stay in that style, and if you don't evolve, you're gonna stay in that pocket, and things you know are not going to necessarily be uh work out in your favor. I guess you could put it that way. You're not going to grow, you're not going to expand, and your fan base is going to stay the same, and that just going to means that you're going to be stuck playing clubs and playing this, that, and the other thing for the rest of your career. And that's up to you whether you want to do that or not. That kind of thing.
As far as like my familiarity with the two bands, I think I definitely have heard of Death Angel more. I'm familiar with the Ultraviolence album and Frolic Through the Park. Um, there I think there's a little bit of like a sarcastic edge in some of their stuff that I kind of like, for me, equate to being a younger person and enjoying that at the time. I mean, they have more longevity for sure. Like they did take a break at a certain point, but like, it's not anywhere close to as long as Dark Angels. It's funny. I had heard of Dark Angel specifically because of their association with Death and the tour that they went on, and Gene Hoglan being part of the band. There's a story of when Chuck reached out to Gene. This was after their tour together, which went really poorly. There was like friends in the scene that they were talking to, and Chuck wanted to reach out to Gene because he thought he'd be great to play on an album with. And their initial conversation, both were kind of apprehensive as far as thinking that there might be bad blood or something, but apparently like Chuck just called him and said, "Hey man, how's it going?" They just started talking about music and stuff like that, and then within like 20 minutes they were talking about recording an album together. And that was just like I always thought that was a fun story because it's like Chuck was just so affable from a lot of people's experiences of, just talking to him. Like everybody just loved to talk music with him. So um my familiarity was not very much until more recent years where I give him a try, but in preparation for this I listened to more. I like the second singer more than I like the original. um that being said, like, it was kind of samey as other stuff that was coming out at the time. I don't think very influential in any way. Um, Death Angel, I think a little more so because they were trying some different stuff than other bands were doing at the time as far as like their attitude and that kind of stuff goes. But this is a really close matchup in my opinion. Like as far as it's hard to kind of pick one over the other, but for the most part, just because of their longevity, having more of an impact with the two albums that are kind of considered, well, really three albums, I would say even the Act Three, has at least some kind of footprint that people are really familiar with. So I would say Death Angel kind of gets the edge on this one.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think just because of when you sit there and you say, okay, who do you know? Death Angel, Dark Angel. Death Angel, I think to me, in terms of popularity, quote unquote, is more popular. Dark Angel, probably closer to sticking more to the roots, and they've always been a certain style, and they've never really changed, and I think that's fine. Definitely one of those things where this was their lane, they stuck to it. Where there's a little bit of kind of a little bit of experimentation with Death Angel that kind of makes him a little bit better in that regards. But even though in the last several albums, yes, they have found a groove and they've stuck to it, but they've got some good songs. So I put it that way. Yes, you were mentioning the first couple albums, Ultraviolence, Frolic Through the Park. Frolic Through the Park is pretty cool. They got a Kiss cover on there, Cold Gin. That's also got one of their biggest songs, Bored, which goes to show you how they weren't necessarily always super pigeonholed into that thrashing because Bored is not a thrash song.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show you that they do have a little bit of versatility. Cold Gin, is also doing that. It shows a little bit of versatility in there. So I think they, in my mind, they take it just because they've had a longer career. They've stuck to it. And where the guys in Dark Angel, they've gotten long, they haven't gotten long. They've stopped, they've started, they stopped, they started. I think it's the legacy. It's in and of itself. It leans more towards Death Angel.
I think sometimes also too many lineup changes of core positions can really change the view of things too. Like if you have a band and they have 18 different singers, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And so it really depends on the band and like because people will talk about Black Sabbath, and I think 90% of the time when somebody says Black Sabbath, they're thinking of Ozzy, right? But there's a lot of fans out there of the different eras of the band. Whereas some bands is like, can y'all just like pick a singer and stick with them? Like because every album's different. It
Right.
really just depends on those things. And Dark Angel's one of those that kind of like unfortunately falls into that category of like too many lineup changes that affect like you may like one album but you may really not like another one just because of the lineup changes.
Right. And I could see that. They've had three different singers, they've had five different drummers. And all five different drummers came before the second album was released. So it makes it even crazy. And even then, Gene was part of Death Angel when the first album was released, but the first album was released based on a previous lineup, with a different drummer. So it just doesn't make any sense. Um, but I get what you're saying. When you see when you hear different vocalists, from album to album, it's kind of like, what are you doing? You know, um, and it's just there's a lot to be said about that, like you said. So I agree with you on that. Um, there's been some lineup changes for Death Angel, but at the same time, it's not one of those that they changed. I think singers from the first album to the second album, I think it was, or um, no, based on their first album, they had changed singers before they started, recording. So they've always
Yeah, I was
had,
gonna say everybody should have been the same. Yeah, yeah,
yeah. So Mark is, but they've changed. Like Gus Pepper's no longer their guitar player. I think Andy Gallion is no longer the drummer, but that doesn't mean that those were affecting the sound and the songwriting as much
yeah.
as with the way it was with Dark Angel. So again, I go with Death Angel on this one, and it sounds like you're going with Death Angel as well.
Yes, I'm definitely going with Death Angel on this one.
All right. So Death Angel will be facing Disturbed in the next round. So we're down to our last final four bands for this episode. So for the next part of the bracket, we've got Dragon Force versus Dream Theater. This should be interesting.
All right, Dragon Force is a UK power metal band formed in 1999. They've got 9 studio albums, and I guess their biggest mainstream success was they had on Guitar Hero "Through the Fire and the Flames," which became kind of a internet sensation in I guess the early 2000s, and then Dream Theater was a U.S. progressive metal band formed in 1985. They've had 16 studio albums, and I would say like they're mostly known like as this. How do you say, like, the technical prog band? There's the joke about how there's no women in the audience. And I think that's kind of been that consistent thing where it's like a bunch of dudes that are just like really into the progressive sound, but masters of their craft. Dragon Force has like this um, unfortunately like kind of tainted image of like people accuse them of like speeding up their music and that kind of stuff. I think it's been kind of proven that that's not the case. Um, but that's always going to be kind of like a little stigma that goes with them. And I mean, both really kind of different, but also niche genres. What are your thoughts on really either of the bands?
All right. So let me start with Dragon Force, because to me, they're the most unique in this particular case. They've had one gold album, Inhuman Rampage. So that's the one I listened to the other day, because those are the ones that's the album that has all their songs on Spotify or predominant. I mean, I say all.
All their most popular, yeah.
Yeah, come off of that. So excuse me. I listened to it and I felt like I was having a heart attack. It was something. Look, I like speed metal. I like metal that sounds fast. Whiplash was the first song I ever heard from Metallica, and at the time was the fastest song I ever heard in my life. Because I still wasn't into Slayer at that point. But I would put it this way: this stuff on Dragon Force, the skill is beyond anything that I've ever heard per se. But at the same time, I can't get into it. It's too fast. And it's a strange thing to say for someone who likes heavy metal. It's just too fast. It's like, bro, let the fucking music breathe. Really. Okay. While the funny thing is that the vocals are not that fast. It's not like, he's doing the breakdown on that Rob Halford does on Defenders of the Faith, Free Will Burning. That breakdown where he's just flying through the vocals, that's not what they're doing. So they're singing on, in Dragon Force. They're singing at a relatively normal pace. I mean, it's quicker because of the music being so fast, but it's like, dude, it doesn't jive to me, and it's just definitely not my thing. They've had however many singers now, and now the newest singer is Alyssa White Loose, who used to be in Arch Enemy.
I had no idea, really.
Yes, she just joined the band like this year. She's their new singer. So they've had two female singers and two guy singers, or two females and one guy singer. It's like, pick one, pick a style in terms of vocals. The only original members left in the band are two guitarists. And while I give it to the drummer who has to keep up with these guys playing guitar, it's like, slow the fuck down and let the songs breathe. They have done that. I mean, not every song is at 400 BPM like most of their stuff, but fuck, man, it's like, to me, it's too much. And then you have the flip side of Dream Theater. Dream Theater, progressive, not as progressive in they've got these really long songs. They've got 10,000 different rhythm changes. They've got, speed changes. They've got timing changes. They've got all sorts of things in their songs, right? Is it good? Is it bad? I'll put it this way. The biggest song that they've ever recorded, Pull Me Under, is pretty straightforward. And that goes to show you what, for the most part, the mainstream likes, so they've never again come close to that, success, but they've been consistent, put it that way. And you know what? They've got a huge fan base, so it's not like people don't dig this shit. It's a huge fan base, but it's a very particular fan base. Like you said, are there a lot of chicks in the crowd? Not so much, And yes, I'm sorry if I hope I didn't offend anybody out there. I'm an old guy, and so I use that term "chicks" a lot. It's no offense. I hope you don't get offended. It's a.
I don't care if you get offended. Just
no, I know.
I don't care.
I know, but we have our listeners, and some of them might, sit there and say, "This guy's living in another time period." It's just a term of endearment. That's all it is.
Yeah, I won't go into more of that, but yeah.
No, I know. So Dream Theater. Look, 16 studio albums. That's no joke. 10 live albums. That doesn't even include the bootleg series. Okay. And then they got one compilation. And I love the title, Greatest Hit and 21 Other Cool Songs. That's an awesome title.
I do like how self-aware they are.
Yes, that helps, because they, the self-awareness allows them to be a little bit more down to earth. So, and then the bootleg series includes 4 cover albums, which is pretty cool too. So, there's that. I like Dream Theater. I don't listen to them very often, but I like them. They're not crazy different from the progressive crazy shit that Tool does, although Tool has a particular lane that they follow in that style. They're progressive, but they're Tool, Dream Theater, more metal. I think Dream Theater would be considered much more metal if James LaBrie wasn't their singer. But,
I would. So, I have a lot of respect for bands that don't necessarily care what the mainstream wants from them. And we've talked about this with Slayer. Like, Slayer could be much more massive if they would just kind of like play what people tend to like more, right? But then they wouldn't be Slayer, right? So there's a balance there of, you have to be good for that to work. Like, you have to actually be a good band. You can't just be like, well, I don't care what the mainstream likes, and then just suck. Like, that doesn't work. So, but like Dream Theater plays what feels right, and they have at times, kind of try to be more mainstream, like Octavarium. Um, that's her album from 2005. There's a lot of like influence from other bands that were around at the time, like even Muse. Like there's a song on there that sounds kind of like a Muse song and stuff. So I mean, it's not like they haven't kind of stepped into those realms, but I don't think it's strictly for trying to be popular. I think, John Petrucci writes what he writes, and he enjoys that kind of stuff. Mike Portnoy is such a diverse drummer. And yeah, I mean, he wasn't there the entire time, obviously, because there's that chunk of time that Mike Mangini was there. But he's the primary drummer for their history, and like he's a strong songwriter as well, and he's such a diverse drummer as far as his abilities go that he likes to experiment and try different things. All of them do. I mean, that is a band of masters of their craft. But the only thing that to me kind of holds him back, in my opinion, is just for my musical taste, is James LaBrie. Like I've just never really enjoyed his voice. I don't have a problem with the guy. I don't think he's a bad guy or anything like that. But like I just don't enjoy his singing that much. But when a Dream Theater song comes on, I don't tend to change it because I do find the music to be extremely interesting, and they've had a lot of consistency as far as like their membership. And Mike Portnoy dropped out a little bit after he joined Avenged Sevenfold for a little while. They've had a couple keyboard changes, and then James LaBrie was their second singer, or technically their third, but let's just say second. That was actually under the Dream Theater banner. And then when it comes to Dragon Force, kind of comes off as like a joke band a lot of times because of their internet meminess. But like, some of the stuff they did, I think ZP was really good with that band. His stuff is more the known music, that Inhuman Rampage kind of stuff that was big at the time, like Through the Fire and the Flames really brought them a lot of attention, like I said, because of what's up the game that I mentioned, not Rock Band, Guitar Hero, sorry. Through the Fire and the Flames really got them a lot of attention because of that game, Guitar Hero. And so I think it's interesting that Alyssa White-Gliss has joined the band. I don't remember another female singer. I only remember 3 singers ever, or two ever. But maybe they had somebody that came in as a temporary or something like that. But there was ZP and then Mark Hudson. I don't remember the others.
Maybe it was the fact that there's ZP, which is fine. Maybe, I don't know. I thought I heard maybe it was a guest vocalist or something like that on the song.
Possibly. Yeah.
I picked up and I heard one female voice, and I'm like, well, I know that's not Alyssa because she's just joined the band.
Yeah.
Because they had a female bassist, Alicia Vigil. So that may have been where I heard, because she's listed as some backing vocals. So
yeah, they do. They do have gang backing vocals. I mean, I think everybody in the band does backing vocals,
right?
So
the thing is, where I got that from. So,
like, power metal's a tough one because power metal can easily become just a little bit like jokey, because of just the genre it is. Like, I think as long as the members of the band don't take themselves too seriously, then it works. Yeah, then it works a lot better. But like, it tends to become self-parody a lot of times. And so for me, I enjoy Dream Theater more. I think they have, much more like ability as musicians. And I don't mean that negatively towards anybody in Dragon Force. I think it's like really impressive to play fast and all that stuff. But I think the interesting changes in their, like, they're just like so much more creative in their abilities. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that because, you have to be to do what they do, you know? And like I said, just take away nothing from Herman Lee and Sam Tottem or Totman, excuse me. They're amazing guitar players, and to be able to have that skill to do what they do is amazing in and of itself. But I literally think that they've pigeonholed themselves into this is all you can do kind of thing, right? And their albums don't stray very far. So it's very similar to what we were talking about with Death Angel and with Exodus. They don't stray very far, so you're not going to really expand past a certain point. Whereas Dream Theater, they have some appeal for certain things, and like you said, they try to make some changes a little bit with Octavarium, and they love to experiment, and they're not going to be the same band every single album, you know but like they have this style. Oh, you know what, we want to play our whole album, and for this concert. They did it for a few of the albums. They're doing it for their latest Parasomnia. They're playing the whole album. you know it works in some cases, and they have a core fan base. That's just the way it is. And same thing with Dragon Force. They have a core fan base, but it's a very limited core fan base if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah, again, like I don't think I think some bands just accept that they're not going to be, the biggest band ever, but at the same time, there's a like acceptance that we are doing what we do, and you could be a ride for the long or not. But again, like you have to be good at it to make that happen, and both of them are doing that. I think Dream Theater just does it a bit better.
Yep, I agree with you. So that means that Dream Theater will move on, and they are going to face the winner on our final round for today. It's going to be Dio versus Down. So what do you got there?
All right, so Dio was formed in 1982. They are really, I would say, Ronnie James Dio's solo band. Had 10 albums and was kind of formed after uh, Dio had left Rainbow and then Black Sabbath, and then he decided, I'm just going to do my own thing. Biggest song would probably be Holy Diver. And then Down is a kind of sludge metal supergroup formed by Phil Anselmo in 1991. And it's been mostly intermittent. I would say it's more of a project than a just standard band. Like it does it when he wants to do it, and has allowed it to be, heavily influenced by his, origins in like New Orleans and stuff like that. So, Dio, I think everybody kind of knows. And then when you say Phil Anselmo, I think like most people know. So there's some name recognition for sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about Ronnie James Dio. You're talking about the one of the biggest voices in metal. And then you're talking about Phil Anselmo. I mean, when Pantera broke up, Phil did. He was doing the whole Ripper Owens thing. He was in 10,000 different bands. And um, and then they were all kind of different styles of music. From crazy extreme deathy sounding stuff to Pantera sounding stuff to sludgy, doom metal stuff. And, Down was one of those bands. Down got signed, and they had a record contract, and they did some really cool shit. But then, all of a sudden that was it. Pantera, Phil decided to do other stuff. And so, between Down's first and second album, there was 7 years, and then there's 5 years between the third album. And then part 4 and 5 are 2 EPs that came out back to back. First one coming out 5 years after the third album. So it's like you said, it's definitely one of those projects as when we can, we'll do it. And they've gotten enough popularity because of the names in the band that they can they can gather an audience. I mean, it's Phil, it's Pepper Keenan from COC, and Kirk Weinstein. I don't know if it's Weinstein or Winstein or whatever you want to call him. But Kirk has been in the band, and then he left, and then he came back. You know, hell, Rex Brown was in the band for a little bit of period of time, but now they've got their Patrick Bruders as the bass player, and then Jimmy Bauer's been their drummer the whole time. So, yes, few and far in between. The style of music is pretty kind of sludgy metal kind of thing, and or just played up straight metal, but it's just kind of like has this rawness to it because that's just what they want to do. They just show up, they record, they go home. You know, I'm not a big fan of theirs. I've never have been. I like a few of the songs on NOLA. When I first got it, I heard it, I listened to it. I'm like, oh, it's not bad. You know, my favorite song is Temptation's Wings. But for me, you know, like I know Stone the Crow is a big song. I know that Bury Me a Smoke is a big song, but nothing to me does what Temptation's Wings does for me. And after that, everything else kind of sounds the same to me. So,
yeah, I'm not really much on Down, to be honest. I had their first album because I liked Pantera, and I did that a lot of times where it was like a member of a band, I put out an album and I was like, yeah, I gotta check this out, and then ended up just not really being the biggest fan. So, you know, not taking anything away from them for that, but it's hard for me to really, give a great review just based on the fact that I didn't really get into their music. I would say, yeah, there's a lot of longevity there as far as like the same guys working together for the most part. I think it's kind of cool that Rex Brown came in for a little while. But they've really gone more back to their focus on the Pantera reunion / tribute. And as far as Dio goes, I mean, that's a whole different experience. It's really his solo project. Brought Vivian Campbell to the forefront. He had a lot of really great contributions on the first 3 albums before he left and went to Def Leppard. Then Craig Goldie came in and he did 1 album, and then rejoined the band a couple times later. The 5th album, I think it was the one where he completely changed the entire lineup, brought in Simon Wright and Rowan Robertson, who was just a young kid at the time, and gave him an opportunity to do something really cool. So he's worked with a lot of really impressive musicians, and Dio himself, like you said, just what a voice. He seemed to be a little bit hard to work with, and I think that's one of those things. Like it's so funny that he was this little guy with a huge personality, and he had how many bands over the course of the years, like even far beyond what most people even think of. Like you did Ronnie and the Red Caps, and then it was like Ronnie and the Elves or something, and then they became like there's like 3 different versions of the bands called Elf, and then obviously Black Sabbath and Rainbow and all this and that, and they just never could like stay consistent, but everybody still speaks so highly of him. You rarely hear from other musicians like them just shit talking him or anything. Like it just sometimes those guys with so much talent and ability, it's like hard to work with. But another thing, like I wanted to say, like was Jeff Pilson actually played on one of his albums too. Who it's funny how a couple guys that we've already talked about today appeared on his albums.
yes.
And so, I think it's just one of those things. Like he's so iconic, and his voice is so massive that it's like hard for me to pick a band that I barely listen to next to like who could easily be called, like if Rob Halford wasn't called the Metal God, like Ronnie would be the next person I would think of that have that moniker.
Speaking of Dio, it's there's such a different, such a contrast. Um, I've finished listening to his book recently, so I have a little bit more insight as to those early bands of his. Um, and but just speaking on his time with his own solo band, when you think about it, I mean, it was started as, he wanted to be in a band. He had been in Rainbow. He was in a band. He made major contributions to the band, but it was always um, it was always Richie Blackmore's band. Even though supposedly at the beginning when they were told, we're making this band Rainbow, it how it became, it was Richie Blackmore's Rainbow. Technically, it was supposed to be Blackmore and Dio's Rainbow, but when the album came out, it said Blackmore's Rainbow. All right, so we'll give it that, right? So he had a strong headstrong personality in the guitar player that he was with. And he was with um, Tony, and that was more along the lines of, "Hey, do you want to hang out and jam?" Yeah, they wrote a song together, and it was like, "Oh shit, this is pretty good." That song happened to be "Children of the Sea," and they said, "Well, what else can we do?" And that turned into, "Hey, you want to join Black Sabbath?" Sure. Okay. And so he joined Black Sabbath. They had a really good working relationship. And then, you know, not to say that it was messed up, but when Geezer came back into the band, because he wasn't really part of the most of the recording sessions for Heaven and Hell, he kind of changed the dynamic because Ronnie was used to writing the lyrics.
Well,
Well,
he was
now,
part of the recording sessions, but he was not in the writing sessions, but he
he wasn't
recorded
writing.
everything.
Yeah, they had another bass player for the when we were writing an early recording. Basically, when he came out of rehab and whatever it was that was going on, then he did his bass parts and they set it up. So he wasn't part of the writing, like you say.
Yeah.
So when he did become part of the writing, there was a conflict. There was basically, you've got Geezer and Tony who've been together since they were, mates back in England. Now you've got this American guy who's coming in with his own ideas. So that's you know the stuff behind Mob Rules, and then more and more conflicts started to happen. He ended up leaving. So with Ronnie and Wendy Dio being his wife, is like, you know what? Let's start a band. I'm going to start my own band, and we'll see what we can do. And that's where Dio forms. And then of course, then eventually, Vivian Campbell gets disgruntled because, hey, I thought this was supposed to be a band. Well, it is, but it's still my band kind of thing. That's the way Ronnie approached it. But he also was trying to be very hands off with it and said, listen, if you got a problem or anything with the way the money is divided, talk to Wendy. She's the boss.
So
So
I just want to add,
uh,
it was Jeff Nichols who was playing the bass. He was involved with a lot of the songwriting, and Geezer was going through a divorce at the time,
that's what it
which
was.
was
The
causing
divorce.
issues. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't rehab, although it probably should have been. Anyway, so he starts the band. He gets these fantastic first two albums. So when you look at what he's gone through, and he decided that I'm no longer going to be subject to someone else's rule, if you want to put it that way, and so he was going to put his stamp on it. Now, why did he go back to Black Sabbath again and deal with that? I guess money talks, bullshit walks, kind of thing. Um,
Well, they liked each other. That's the thing too, is that I think on a professional level they had a lot of difficulties, but on a personal level they liked each other. And there was some unfinished business. They wanted to go back and finish it, and the same problems just arised again.
Yeah, well, there's the same problem being Ozzy was, wanted Black Sabbath to play his final concert. And Dio's like, fuck no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
So I get that, and there went that one again. And then again, like you said, there was this crazy amount of mutual respect when they got into a room together, Tony and Ronnie and Geezer. It was like magic. So that's when, all those years later, Heaven and Hell formed, when Black Sabbath was no longer a functioning band because Ozzy wasn't a functioning human for the most part. He was going through his different injuries and ailments over the years. Regardless, Dio, the band, great first 3 albums, and then then that's when the wheels fell off, kind of thing, and they started changing. They started changing personnel. It became much more of the Ronnie James Dio project, and having all these different musicians play over the years. Always had great musicians. Always had good recordings. It's just a matter of the popularity of his style of music obviously waned in the 90s, but he stuck to it. He did not become grunge. But at the same time, the songwriting still lacked somewhere in there, but there was a lot of inconsistency, because after Dream Evil, it took 3 years to come out with Lock Up the Wolves, another 3 years to come out with Strange Highways, because he's doing all these different things in between. He rejoined Black Sabbath and then quits and goes, I'm going to start Dio again. And, then he takes 3 years to do another album, then 4 years to do an album after that. So there was a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of personal projects he was working on in between. I get it. It happens. But the legacy of the band Dio in and of itself stands alone and definitely stands the test of time as far as being impactful and something that heavy metal needed and still has today.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dio eclipses Down on this one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Down's cool. Down's a fun band for Phil to hang out with and do stuff with his bros from New Orleans. But the bottom line is it's not a regular band. So I put Dio over Down. You put Dio over Down. So Dio wins. They'll face Dream Theater in the next round. So basically, Demon Hunter versus Demo Borgir, excuse me. Death versus Def Leppard. Disturbed versus Death Angel. Dream Theater versus Dio. So we're going to end the episode right here and let you guys stew on the bands that made it through to the quarterfinals. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Debating Metal. And if you did, please click like or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you can get our latest download as soon as it drops. And while you're there, why don't you go ahead and leave us a comment?
And don't forget, you can interact with us on Facebook, Instagram, and on X, or send us an email to debatingmetal@gmail.com. YouTube viewers, click subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when we post a new show. And remember to tune into the next episode of Debating Metal for part 2 of the ABCs of Metal, letter D. On behalf of Kenneth and myself, stay safe and always turn it up to 11.
See ya.